Genre is a kind of writing, and paying close attention to genre is essential for biblical interpretation. There are many different kinds of writing in the Bible, and knowing what we're reading is really an important first step. Let's take an example. In Psalm 22 we hear, "But I am just a worm, less than human, insulted by one person, despised by another." If we don't really tap into the fact that we're reading poetry here, we might be less clear that this is a metaphor. Maybe we're clear it's a metaphor. I am a worm, I am just a worm, probably strikes us all as a metaphor. But knowing we're in poetry where metaphor is very prominent helps us to say, oh, we're not surprised by this kind of language. This is a metaphor, just a picture of how low the psalmist is feeling in this passage. There are three major genres of the Bible: poetry, narrative, and letter or epistle. And in this video, we're going to talk about the purposes and features of each of these, kind of an overview for us as we think about biblical genres. So let's start with poetry, since we've already introduced a poem here, part of a poem. Biblical poetry is used, an author will move into poetry to evoke emotions and to express what is for us often beyond words. You use poetry when you're trying to describe something that moves us beyond language in some ways. And so when we're talking about God, when we're worshiping God, when we're crying out to God in lament, it's very, very common to move into poetic language. Where do we find biblical poetry? Well, we find biblical poetry in many Old Testament books. The Psalms or the songs, so Psalms and Song of Solomon, wisdom literature like Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, and prophetic literature, Isaiah, Nahum, Obadiah. Poetry is also used within some New Testament books, but we don't have a whole book of poetry in the New Testament, but we have poetic language in some of Jesus' teachings, like the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, in the Christ poem or poetic language of Philippians 2, 6 through 11. Some key features of biblical poetry include imagery. Imagery is a really important part of much poetry across the world and across the ancient world as well. Think of Psalm 42. "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for you, for the living God. Where can I go and meet with God?" This picture of a deer panting provides the psalmist a picture of his own longing for God. So we have imagery very frequently used in the poetic books or in poetic sections of books. Another feature of biblical poetry, sound devices, things like alliteration and wordplay. Now, unless we're working with the original languages, we're not going to always hear those. But it's nice to know that those are also a part of the biblical text. And translators will often try to utilize sound devices where they hear them in the text, so they probably can't reproduce them exactly because of the difference between Hebrew and English, for example. In Psalm 122:6, we hear, "Pray now for the peace of Jerusalem." Lovely kind of wordplay or alliteration going on here. Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. So we have this repetition of sound that's very pleasing to the ear and has this beautiful cadence to it. Another key feature of biblical poetry, structural devices of various kinds. One example is chiasm, which is a pattern that's A, B, B, A, or A, B, C, C, B, A, kind of a return to where you have come from. And in Matthew 7:6, a teaching of Jesus that's quite poetic in form, we hear a chiasm, where Jesus teaches, "Do not give dogs what is sacred, or do not throw your pearls to pigs. If they do, they may trample them under feet." That is what pigs do versus dogs do, "and turn and tear you to pieces," what dogs do versus what pigs do. So A, B, B, A. Here in both cases, we need to hear about these as wild dogs and wild pigs. That helps us to hear the imagery as well. Another example of a structural device is an acrostic, which is an use of alphabet to structure part or a whole of a poem. Psalm 119 is a great example because as you look in it in your English Bible, you will usually have headings like Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet for each of the 8 lines of poetry in that section. It's also the reason that is such a long psalm, because it has a whole alphabet structuring 8 lines by 8 lines by 8 lines. A very interesting feature of biblical poetry is parallelism. And this isn't something that we see in modern poetry, for example, but it's very important to Hebrew poetry. It's a balancing of two or more lines in kind of either synonymous, similar kind of ideas, or antithetical ideas, or in some cases something called synthetic parallelism. So an example of synonymous parallelism comes in Psalm 1:5. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. And you can hear parallel ideas in the wicked and sinners and the judgment and the assembly. And then the very next verse in Psalm 1, we hear an example of antithetical parallelism. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. So a balancing of ideas and even forms between lines is something called parallelism. So let's jump to biblical narrative, a whole different genre that functions differently and is used for different purposes. Why do authors in the Bible use historical narrative particularly? To communicate the significance of key events or people, what we might call theological history. We have biblical narrative across many, many biblical books. Many Old Testament books, including the historical Old Testament books, and also some narrative in prophetic books. There's some narrative in Isaiah, some in Jeremiah. And then in the New Testament, over half of the New Testament is historical narrative or biblical narrative, the Gospels and Acts. Some of the key features of biblical narrative are attention to plot, various plot elements like characters, settings, events, conflict and resolution. So things that we often pay attention to when we're in a narrative. We do pay attention to the people and what they're doing and where they are and what's going on. I find it helpful to highlight then the things that I'm not as prone to pay attention to in biblical narrative, which would be the second thing here, the thematic or theological communication that an author is giving us, sometimes or even often implicit to the story. Here's where we can look for themes that come and stretch across a narrative. For example, in the book of Exodus, God's covenanting with Israel and God's presence with them that comes in the whole second half of the book where they build a tabernacle. God tells them to build a tabernacle, they build it, and then God comes to dwell with them at the very end scene of Exodus. Repetition of key ideas, which is a sort of a way of thinking about theme, but we can think about ideas and not just specific terms, and that can help us understand themes in narrative. For example, the faithfulness and primarily unfaithfulness of various kings in Judah and Israel across the book of Kings. Point of view is helpful to pay attention to in narrative. For example, when the Pharisees in Matthew 12 say, this one, Jesus, casts out demons by the prince of demons, we'll want to say, no, that is not actually Matthew's point of view. It's not Jesus' point of view. And so they have a wrong point of view. So to pay attention to who has the authorized or right point of view in the story is very helpful. Authorized voices, for example, Jesus in the gospel always has the authorized voice. Much of the time John the Baptist does, but on one occasion in Matthew 11, John asks, is this the one who is to come, or should we look for another? Are you the one who is to come? Should we look for another? So in that case, John's lack of knowledge is not authorized. We know already who Jesus is and that he is the true one who was to come. And then let's turn to biblical letters or epistles and talk about how communication happens there. First of all, why compose a letter? The first and obvious reason is to communicate across a distance. In the ancient world, letters were very necessary to communicate across spans of space and to get word out about something or to give news to somebody you love and care for across a distance. And then specifically, we hear in the biblical epistles, the authors encouraging and guiding, addressing problems, sharing news, things you'd expect in a letter. We hear the letters in the New Testament, letters of Paul, Romans through Philemon, and also the general epistles, Hebrews through Jude. So quite a bit of material that is letter in the New Testament. What are some of the key features of biblical letters? First, we can talk about the format of ancient letters. Greetings at the beginning, both the recipient and the audience, and then also the recipient, audience, and the author are mentioned at the beginning. Thanksgiving or and or prayer is a part of an ancient letter, not just the biblical letters. Letters in general had an expression of well-wishing for the audience or a prayer to the gods. So this is a usual part of the letter. New Testament authors often expand these significantly. And then the body of the letter, which is concerned with whatever needs to be addressed, and then concluding remarks. Another feature of biblical letters is that they have these occasioned topics, that body of the letter that gets filled in and whatever needs to be talked about or expressed. These are occasioned, and this is what Strauss calls in his book the occasional nature of the New Testament letters. He doesn't mean by that they have no relevance for today. It means that an occasion has caused Paul or another New Testament writer to write about these things. In other words, what we have in the New Testament letters is often pastoral or practical theology, theology on the ground, not just Paul writing from a lofty theological vantage point, but talking about what is it like to live out this faith on the ground and what's important for them to pay attention to. And here I'd also mention that these were meant for public reading. Any letter of Paul's or someone else's that arrived on the scene would have been read out to the whole congregation or numbers of house churches, depending on the context. And that's an important piece for interpretation as well. So in summary, as we think about genre, it's important to know what kind of writing you are reading as you come to the biblical text at any particular point or turn. Learning the historical contours of various biblical genres, for example, the Gospels and their counterparts in Greco-Roman biography, they resemble that. They're not exactly like that, but they have some resemblance. Learning those historical contours of genres is very important. It can be very helpful for our interpretation, for our exegesis. Where do you find these kinds of discussions? I can point you to Scripture's Communication, chapter 7. I talk about these big three genres, poetry, narrative, epistle. And there are also books that spend a chapter on each of these and more. So there's a lot of tools out there that can help us think about biblical genre more thoughtfully to help us as we interpret the Bible.